the aftermath of the Second World War, the world celebrated victory, but few knew how much had been concealed beneath layers of secrecy, deception, and deliberate omission. Behind the official communiqué, the parades and the triumphal speeches, locked doors and sealed files told another story, a story of calculated brutality, desperate contingencies, and betrayals buried so deep that only fragments would ever see the light of day. Governments wrote their histories carefully, drawing attention to victory while smothering the evidence of atrocities, secret bargains, and operations that were never meant to be remembered. Across London, Berlin, Moscow, and Tokyo, intelligence agencies gathered and destroyed reports that contradicted the narrative of honor and justice. In the shadows of archives stamped with top secret, lurked evidence of extermination campaigns disguised as military sweeps, of Allied leaders ready to unleash chemical infernos, of convoys erased from the record books, and of laboratories whose crimes were never prosecuted. The Second World War was not only fought on battlefields with tanks and planes, but also in sealed chambers of deception, coded dispatches, and directives designed to vanish from history. What was hidden from the public was not merely the scale of destruction, but the lengths to which states went to ensure silence. Decades later, fragments of these forbidden files surface, revealing stories that chill the blood and unsettle the notion of justice. What you're about to hear are not legends or exaggerations, but suppressed truths, disturbing secrets from a war that ended in 1945, but still cast shadows no one was meant to see. Chapter 1: Operation Iron Wolf Extermination Files. In the labyrinth of Eastern Front operations, there exists a name whispered only in fragments among declassified Soviet archives and half-burnt Gestapo reports: Operation Iron Wolf. Between 1942 and 1944, while the world's eyes focused on the great battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, another campaign unfolded in the forests and marshes of Lithuania and Belarus. Unlike the clash of armies, this was not about territory or supply lines. It was about silence. The silence of villages erased, of families obliterated, and of records meticulously altered to ensure that no trace of the slaughter remained. The origins of Operation Iron Wolf lie in an obscure directive signed under Himmler's authority, filed under SS Operations Order No. 187, dated November 1942. This document, preserved only in partial Soviet copies captured in Königsberg in 1945, outlined a ruthless strategy to extinguish not just partisan resistance, but the civilian foundations that nourished it. Gestapo File No. 17, later recovered from a bombed-out Berlin archive, contained chilling language. Villages were to be pacified, populations resettled, and records standardized for deletion. Behind the bureaucratic euphemisms lay systematic extermination. Field reports from the SS Dirlewanger Brigade, infamous for atrocities in Warsaw, describe entire communities accused of collaboration. A single act, such as supplying bread or shelter to partisans, could doom an entire settlement. In May 1943, the village of Kaniukai in Lithuania was surrounded at dawn. Soviet testimonies recorded decades later recount how men were lined against barn walls, women were locked inside their houses, and both were set ablaze. The flames consumed not only lives but identities, as Gestapo officers ordered registers and baptism records to be destroyed to eliminate traces of the victims. The Wehrmacht, officially detached from such operations, often provided logistical support. Decrypted British intercepts from Bletchley Park reveal references to Iron Wolf actions, though the true nature of the phrase remained concealed from Allied command structures. The codename was presumed to refer to anti-partisan sweeps, but the details never reached strategic assessments. Instead, they were buried in Red File Series K, inaccessible until fragments surfaced in the late 1980s. What made Iron Wolf particularly insidious was the collaboration of local auxiliary police units, coerced or convinced by Nazi propaganda to join in the purges. These units, often recruited from ethnic divisions resentful of Soviet occupation, served as executioners. Soviet NKVD interrogations of captured auxiliaries reveal chilling precision: the systematic division of tasks, one squad burning dwellings, another confiscating possessions, and yet another executing the inhabitants. Afterward, burial sites were disguised, forests replanted, and villages erased from maps. In one chilling case, the Belarusian hamlet of Novaya Rudnya was wiped from existence in July 1943. NKVD file 731-6K details how a Luftwaffe reconnaissance unit later flew over the coordinates and found only scorched earth. No survivors. The file notes in stark language. Village erased. No trace. For official silence, the Soviets documented these crimes meticulously, yet chose silence. Stalin's regime withheld the most damning records, fearing that the exposure of local collaboration would inflame post-war ethnic tensions across the Union. Thus, evidence was sealed in classified archives under counter-insurgency incidents, deliberately disguised to obscure their genocidal nature. Western intelligence, too, held fragments, intercepted Wehrmacht dispatches, accounts from escaped partisans, but these were locked away under security legislation, filed under restricted wartime intelligence and never revealed to the public. For decades, Iron Wolf was a phantom operation, whispered about among historians but never proven. Survivors' testimonies were discounted as exaggerations, their villages absent from official maps. Only after the Soviet Union's collapse did documents emerge. Burned edges, censored names, blurred signatures, pieced together like a mosaic of horror. Each fragment confirmed what survivors had long insisted, that entire communities had been methodically eliminated, not as collateral in war, but as part of a calculated directive. The number of dead remains unknown. Soviet estimates place it in the tens of thousands, though some modern scholars argue it was higher. Entire family lines disappeared, leaving no descendants to speak for them. What remains are fragments: a half-burnt baptismal record found in Vilnius, a coded Wehrmacht transmission misfiled in London, and the words of a single survivor etched into an NKVD interrogation transcript. "We were not killed as soldiers," it reads. "We were erased as though we had never lived." This was the true nature of Operation Iron Wolf. Not a campaign of war, but a campaign of eradication, carefully hidden, designed to vanish without a trace. It was an extermination not meant to be remembered, until the archives began to whisper back. Chapter 2. The Allied Chemical Warfare Pact. Among the hidden corridors of wartime decision-making, far from the speeches of unity and liberation, lies a pact that was never intended for public knowledge, declassified in fragments from the British National Archives and partially confirmed by documents discovered at the US Army Chemical Corps in Aberdeen, Maryland. The plan carried the codename Directive Blackthorn. Drafted in late 1944, this joint Anglo-American contingency revolved around one terrible calculation. If Hitler unleashed his chemical stockpiles of nerve agents, the Allies would retaliate with overwhelming chemical warfare of their own. What few outside inner war cabinets knew was that the Allies themselves were fully prepared to strike first, under circumstances defined only by the Prime Minister's seal of approval. The roots of this pact can be traced back to Allied intelligence reports from summer 1943, which confirmed the Reich's possession of a new class of chemical agents, Tabun, designated by German scientists as Trilon 83. MI6 Chemical Section, working in conjunction with ultra-decrypts, intercepted fragments of correspondence between IG Farben laboratories and the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Office, revealing production at Daiherrenfurth in Silesia. By 1944, Churchill's advisors, fearing desperation in Berlin, began drafting protocols for chemical response. Minutes from the War Cabinet's Defense Committee, reference file CAB 8077, detail discussions between Sir Archibald Sinclair, the Air Minister, and US representatives of the Chemical Warfare Service. The directive that followed was blunt. Should the Reich deploy gas, or should intelligence indicate imminent release, immediate retaliatory strikes will commence against predetermined targets. But buried beneath the clauses was the unspoken option of a preemptive strike. Bari, Italy, already scarred by the December 1943 Luftwaffe raid that exposed US mustard gas stockpiles, became a central hub. Liberty ships anchored in the Mediterranean carried hundreds of tons of vesicant agents, sealed in barrels marked as special ordnance. Similar caches were hidden in Liverpool and Bristol, far from public view. The War Office placed these under the codename Operation Alabaster, their deployment contingent only on Churchill's private authorization, transmitted through sealed cipher channels. The Soviets, ever watchful, were not blind to these preparations. NKVD archives reveal decrypted reports from London codenamed Snowdrop, which confirmed to Stalin that the Allies were not only stockpiling, but actively rehearsing retaliatory strikes. Soviet generals, already aware of German gas development, responded by discreetly preparing their own countermeasures. By spring 1945, chemical defense units were positioned along the Baltic frontier, while research facilities near Sverdlovsk accelerated experiments with anthrax-resistant livestock and civilian gas mask distribution. The Kremlin never admitted possession of its own offensive stockpiles, but captured German officers later testified that Soviet interrogators frequently demanded details of chemical dispersal mechanisms. The public, meanwhile, remained unaware. No mention of chemical warfare plans was ever allowed to circulate in Allied press. Soldiers received no training manuals, no instructions, beyond basic respirator drills. Yet within the sealed chambers of Whitehall, discussions carried a different tone. Churchill himself, in correspondence preserved under file Prem 366, wrote chillingly in July 1944, "It may be necessary, in the event of enemy madness, to respond with utter devastation. Preparations must be complete." Historians argue whether enemy madness was a euphemism for actual German use, or simply the possibility of desperation. Evidence suggests the Allies nearly crossed that line. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, decrypted signals suggested the possibility of a last-ditch chemical release. US air forces in Europe received coded standby orders, while Royal Air Force squadrons were briefed on specialized bombing runs carrying M47A2 chemical bombs. Although never executed, the orders remain in records marked Emergency Directive for eyes of Prime Minister only. Had the war extended even weeks longer, the skies over Germany could have darkened with gas clouds, turning cities already shattered by firebombs into suffocating chambers. The secrecy of Directive Blackthorn extended into the post-war period. Many records were deliberately withheld during the Nuremberg trials, as Allied leaders feared exposure of their own willingness to use banned weapons. Testimonies from captured German scientists on Allied stockpiles were edited or excluded. The official narrative portrayed restraint and adherence to the Geneva Protocol, when in reality, both sides stood ready to unleash catastrophe. The most disturbing revelation lies not only in the preparations, but in the willingness to silence evidence. Survivors of the Barry disaster, many scarred by mustard gas exposure, were forbidden from speaking publicly. Medical records were sealed, compensation denied, and references to chemical injuries were redacted in military hospitals. Files released under the US Freedom of Information Act decades later revealed entire naval manifests coded under general ordnance, concealing hundreds of tons of chemical agents. The world celebrated VE Day on May 8, 1945, believing the war had ended without the use of chemical weapons. Yet in locked rooms beneath Whitehall and the Pentagon, officials knew how close humanity had come to crossing that threshold. The truth was not that gas had been avoided by moral restraint, but that its release had been narrowly averted by circumstance. Hitler hesitated, fearing Allied retaliation. The Allies, in turn, prepared to strike, their hands hovering over orders sealed in cipher envelopes. Directive Blackthorn remained buried for decades, sealed in most secret classifications. It was not until the 1990s that fragments surfaced, hinting at the full scale of preparations. Even today, portions of the files remain redacted, names blacked out, pages missing. The public narrative of a clean victory, free from chemical horrors, is a fragile illusion. Behind it lies the reality of stockpiles waiting to be deployed, of war cabinets ready to drench Europe in unseen poison, and of leaders who quietly weighed the annihilation of millions to secure victory. The Allied Chemical Warfare Pact was not merely a response plan, it was a calculated bargain with silence, a pact written in coded directives and buried beneath national pride. What the world remembers as restraint was, in truth, the shadow of devastation lingering at the very edge of execution. Chapter 3: Ghost Convoys of the Arctic Sea. In the frigid waters of the Barents Sea, between the ice floes and the howling gales of the polar winter, entire Allied convoys disappeared without explanation. The official records of the Arctic convoys, those lifelines carrying tanks, aircraft, and ammunition from Britain and America to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, list losses to U-boats, Luftwaffe raids, and the unforgiving climate. But hidden within faded Kriegsmarine logs and Soviet naval archives is another story. One of convoys that vanished without a trace, erased not by torpedoes or storms, but by deception, betrayal, and the deliberate manipulation of intelligence. These vanished formations were later whispered of as the ghost convoys. The most notorious case came in late 1943, when convoy WWII, a diversionary fleet sailing under Royal Navy escort, strayed hundreds of miles off its intended route. British Admiralty charts omit its true course. Declassified fragments from the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park, however, suggest something extraordinary. Enigma intercepts were altered before reaching the convoy commanders. Instead of safe passages, ships were directed into Arctic black zones, areas where the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine awaited with ambush formations. Within days, signals from several ships ceased. No wreckage was ever recovered. No survivors were officially recorded. The only evidence of their fate comes from scattered survivor testimonies smuggled through Soviet channels, many later suppressed under Stalin's orders. The possibility of sabotage lies at the heart of the mystery. MI6's post-war review, known as Special File Northlight, concluded that German intelligence had received convoy coordinates too precise to be coincidence. Investigators discovered that a Polish cipher clerk embedded within the Allied communications branch may have been feeding altered signal groups directly to the Abwehr. His identity remains classified, though fragments of his interrogation transcripts survive in Polish archives, marked Case File Delta 11. According to one heavily redacted page, the clerk admitted under duress to copying sequences for the Abwehr, claiming he believed they would be used only for monitoring, not for direct attack. Yet the pattern of lost ships suggested otherwise. The Soviet response was fury cloaked in silence. Stalin, already suspicious of Allied intentions, accused Churchill privately of withholding reinforcements. A transcript of the October 1943 Kremlin session records him saying, "The convoys promised do not arrive. Are they lost or withheld? To preserve the alliance, Churchill ordered British naval reports on missing ships, sealed under the Official Secrets Act. The missing hulls were filed as lost due to hostile action, unspecified. Families of the sailors were told nothing more. The wrecks themselves remain elusive." Soviet divers sent into the Barents in the 1950s claimed to have discovered unidentified hulls beneath layers of ice and silt. Their markings erased. Photographs taken by a classified expedition, codenamed Operation Polar Echo, show the shattered remains of Liberty-class ships lying side by side, their holds still containing crated Sherman tanks bound. For the Eastern Front, the images were suppressed and later surfaced only in fragments through defectors. The tragedy of the ghost convoys was not only in their loss but in the erasure of their memory. Naval war diaries omit their names. The Admiralty's official convoy lists jump abruptly, with gaps explained as clerical oversight. Yet cross-referencing German U-boat kill logs with British records reveals an absence. Ships that should have been accounted for, simply missing from both sides' tallies. This suggests a deliberate effort to wipe them from the record, ensuring that no formal investigation could ever demand accountability. Eyewitness fragments describe scenes of betrayal. One Soviet sailor, interrogated by the NKVD in 1944, claimed his vessel followed what he believed was an official radio beacon, only to enter a kill zone where Stuka dive bombers tore into the convoy. His account ends abruptly in the archive transcript. A final line reading, "Further testimony classified under state security code." Other testimonies describe German ships arriving at precise coordinates within hours of Allied signals, as if the enemy knew the convoy's location before it had even departed. For decades, the families of those sailors received no closure. Letters of inquiry were returned with standardized responses. "Your husband was lost at sea due to enemy action." No further details are available. Only in the 1980s, when fragments of Bletchley Park files were released, did researchers begin to connect the dots. They found references to Arctic Black, a term used in decrypted dispatches but absent from official histories. This designation appears only in 3 surviving memoranda, each stamped "Most Secret, Destroy after reading." The existence of ghost convoys undermined one of the most celebrated narratives of the war, the Arctic lifeline of Allied solidarity. Acknowledging that ships had been deliberately betrayed, that signals had been altered from within, would have fractured the carefully maintained image of trust between allies. And so silence prevailed. Stalin's suspicion remained buried in Kremlin files. British officials ensured naval records were sanitized. American involvement was minimized, yet the sea does not forget. The wrecks remain on the seabed, mute witnesses to a betrayal never officially admitted. Sonar scans by Norwegian expeditions in the 1990s uncovered unidentified ships lying in patterns consistent with convoy formations. Their registry numbers filed off or destroyed. Historians who pressed for recognition were met with denials. Their requests for declassification returned stamped. No records exist, but fragments do exist. A single page of an MI6 review notes, several convoys never acknowledged. Loss attributed to Arctic Black. Deliberate. Deletion enacted. This is the closest thing to an admission. The world has. The ghost convoys of the Arctic Sea represent not only a tragedy of lives lost, but of truth erased. Thousands of sailors perished in frozen waters, their sacrifices buried under state secrecy. Families were denied closure. History was denied accuracy. And the Arctic itself became a graveyard for ships erased from the record. Even now, the unanswered question lingers. Were these convoys sacrificed deliberately, betrayed by double agents, or erased to conceal failures at the highest level? The archives whisper fragments, but the silence of governments remains absolute. Chapter 4. Japan's Forgotten Unit. 100 Experiments. The name Unit 731 has long been synonymous with the horrors of Japanese biological warfare during the Second World War. But hidden in the shadow of that infamous facility was another secret division, one even less known yet equally sinister. Designated Unit 100 and operating under the cover of the Kwantung Army's Veterinary Division. It carried out experiments so meticulously concealed that many of its files never entered the historical record. Where Unit 731 focused on plague, frostbite, and vivisection, Unit 100's role was to weaponize diseases against animals and humans alike, crippling the Soviet Union's food supply and rendering whole regions uninhabitable. Unit 100 was headquartered near Changchun in occupied Manchuria. Established in 1936 under the command of Major General Yujiro Wakamatsu, officially it was tasked with veterinary research to protect Japanese horses from disease. In reality, it operated as a covert bioweapons laboratory. NKVD interrogations of captured Japanese officers after 1945 revealed chilling details. Cattle and horses were deliberately infected with anthrax, glanders, and rinderpest, then herded into controlled enclosures to measure transmission. Chinese civilians, often prisoners accused of resistance, were used as unwitting test subjects, their exposure concealed under agricultural terminology. In a Soviet intelligence memorandum dated December 1945, file number 347S, interrogators recorded, subjects were infected under the guise of veterinary control. Termination followed upon completion of observations. Unlike Unit 731, which the Allies reluctantly documented during the Tokyo trials, Unit 100 was almost entirely omitted. Its operations were hidden behind layers of euphemism. Test villages were constructed to simulate real environments with wells, livestock pens, and family dwellings. Pathogens were introduced through contaminated feed and water. Within days, livestock collapsed, villagers developed fevers, and the results were meticulously recorded in bound ledgers coded as crop yield studies. When entire populations succumbed, the sites were burned and surviving witnesses executed. Soviet patrols later discovered ash pits containing animal carcasses and human remains, but official reports buried these findings under counter-insurgency casualties. The American role in concealing Unit 100's crimes was decisive. US intelligence officers, eager to secure Japanese biological data for their own programs at Fort Detrick, struck secret immunity deals with captured Unit 100 personnel. Declassified CIA memoranda from 1956, codenamed Project Harvest, confirm that reports on livestock incapacitation pathogens were absorbed into US biowarfare research. These documents reveal chilling parallels between Unit 100's field trials and later US experiments during the Korean War. Immunity was extended not only to scientists from Unit 731, but also to veterinarians and technicians from Unit 100, ensuring that their crimes would never be prosecuted in court. The Japanese government, too, erased its tracks. Post-war agricultural ministry files were purged of references to Unit 100, and surviving veterans swore secrecy under penalty of imprisonment. To this day, the majority of Unit 100's personnel never faced justice. Their names do not appear in trial records, their crimes buried beneath layers of classified agricultural research. Survivors from Manchurian villages who attempted to testify were silenced. Chinese petitions to include Unit 100 evidence at the Tokyo trials were rejected by American prosecutors, who argued it would complicate proceedings. The complicity of silence ensured that generations would grow up unaware of the atrocities committed in the name of veterinary research. Eyewitness testimony from Chinese villagers paints a picture of methodical cruelty. One survivor from a hamlet near Changchun described how his family's cattle died within days of consuming feed supplied by Japanese soldiers. Soon after, villagers developed blackened swellings, fevers, and collapsed in agony. Japanese personnel observed from a distance, recording data before burning the village to the ground. Another testimony, smuggled to the Chinese People's Liberation Army in 1946, described wells poisoned with glanders. Horses drank first, collapsing within hours, followed by villagers who consumed the same water. None survived. Soviet forces who liberated Manchuria in 1945 discovered remnants of laboratories containing caged animals, glass vials labeled in code, and burial pits filled with lime. A classified NKVD report from 1947 noted, "Laboratories clearly designed for controlled infection. Human experimentation probable, though records destroyed." Unlike Unit 731, which the Soviets prosecuted in the Khabarovsk trials of 1949, Unit 100 evidence was considered strategically sensitive and quietly archived. Stalin had no desire to publicize atrocities that mirrored Soviet bioweapons development. The crimes of Unit 100 were thus consigned to obscurity, their files sealed under agricultural intelligence. Today, fragments of Unit 100's legacy survive in obscure archives. Chinese records describe entire regions where livestock diseases surged mysteriously during the war years. Soviet files, declassified in part during the 1990s, confirm that pathogens used by Unit 100 matched those later detected in biowarfare stockpiles. American records at Fort Detrick remain heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out under national security. The survivors of Manchuria never saw justice, their testimony drowned in a sea of classified files and deliberate denials. What makes Unit 100 so disturbing is not only its cruelty, but its invisibility. Where Unit 731 became infamous through post-war revelations, Unit 100's atrocities were deliberately concealed, its personnel protected, its crimes buried under scientific jargon. The world remembers vivisections and plague bombs, but it has largely forgotten the poisoned wells, the diseased cattle, and the villages erased from maps. The silence surrounding Unit 100 is not accidental. It is the result of calculated decisions made in Tokyo, Moscow, and Washington, decisions to preserve useful knowledge at the expense of truth and justice. Japan's forgotten Unit 100 remains a ghost of history, concealed in agricultural files and veterinary reports, its crimes hidden beneath euphemism. But in the fragments that surface, in the testimony of survivors, in the ash pits of Manchuria, in the redacted files of Fort Detrick, the truth remains, waiting for recognition. It was an atrocity designed to be forgotten, but the earth itself remembers. The bones of livestock and villagers lie beneath Manchurian soil, silent witnesses to crimes the world has yet to fully confront. The war ended in 1945, but the shadows it cast have never truly lifted. For decades, archives remain sealed, files stamped most secret, and testimonies buried under censorship or silence. The stories that have surfaced, of Operation Iron Wolf, of Directive Blackthorn, of the Ghost Convoys, and of Unit 100, are not the tales written in textbooks or celebrated in memorials. They are fragments of a forbidden history, evidence of choices and atrocities that governments judge too dangerous to reveal. Each one exposes not only the cruelty of war, but also the cold calculations made in secret rooms, far from the battlefield, where leaders weighed lives against strategy and morality against expedience. What remains most disturbing is not only what happened, but what was erased. Whole villages wiped from maps, convoys deleted from naval records, laboratories disguised as agricultural stations, and directives written to vanish once read. Silence became its own weapon, wielded as effectively as any rifle or bomb. Even today, the archives resist disclosure, with pages redacted, names obscured, and questions left deliberately unanswered. What is hidden may be as vast as what has been uncovered. These stories raise an unsettling truth, that history as we know it is incomplete, curated by those who chose which horrors to remember and which to bury. As fragments continue to surface, a burned report, a misfiled transmission, a survivor's testimony long ignored, the war reveals itself again, darker and more complex than the version celebrated in public. And so the question lingers: how many more secrets still lie locked in vaults, waiting to resurface, ready to remind us that the past is never truly past, and that some truths were never meant to be known?